Welcome, Pedro. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone else. This is Pedro. He's a PhD student in the Brown's Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies. He has previously obtained his BA in Portuguese Studies and an MA in Literary Theory from the University of Porto in Portugal. And among his many accomplishments, Pedro has worked as a lecturer at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of California, Santa Barbara for 2 years. And he has published several articles in both English and Portuguese, including his most recent, The Past is a Foreign Photo, Image and Travel Writing in the Benguela Railway, Angola, in the e-Journal of Portuguese History last year. He has also co-authored the book chapter No Man Can Put All the World in a Book on the concept of scientific representation in Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing in 2017. Thank you for joining us again. Much of your current writing is preoccupied with the question of travel and travel writing. And so maybe as a way to get us started, I kind of wanted to ask you sort of what provoked you yourself to make that big jump from studying your country from the inside in some way to looking at it more from the outside and basically moving from Europe to the US in your studies?
Thank you, Irina, for such a kind introduction. So as a college student, I was studying Portuguese and Lusophone literature and culture. And that is a very European-based or Eurocentric approach to the languages and the cultures of Lusophone expression. So then when I moved on to my master's, I decided that I wanted to sort of branch out, and I did, as you mentioned, literary theory. And then in 2013, I was invited to work at UC Santa Barbara, where I was teaching Portuguese literature, Portuguese history, Portuguese and Brazilian cinema. And that, in many ways, marked a sort of turn in my way of understanding languages, cultures, and literatures. So whereas up until then, I was very familiar with a certain kind of approach, with a certain kind of language, with certain references, and let's say a grammar of talking about places. When I moved to the US, I realized that what I had always assumed to be my central subject, my central topic, was actually a very peripheric thing and a very insular thing in the larger realm of things. So that marked a change.
And what would that subject be, if you want to sort of elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. So when I moved to the US, I was still teaching Portuguese language, literature, and history. And then when I came to Brown, I realized that I had the chance to open up my horizons and expand my research field. So that was the moment when I realized that I would like to work with Portugal, Brazil, and Angola, and especially, as you just mentioned, with travel writing. Why is that, and why that kind of specific crop? Well, because I wanted to understand better how these spaces were constructed from a foreigner's perspective. That is, how the external gaze was writing about these places and also transforming them as they were writing about them. So that's why my corpus right now includes travelogues written in Lisbon, Benguela, and Rio de Janeiro between 1900 and 1930, 1940 approximately, and written originally in English, so mostly by English or American travelers.
Okay, well, that's super fascinating. Thank you. Let's maybe take a step back for 1 second and talk about one of your earlier papers that I was able to read in preparation for this, and it's called The Time of Others, Cities and Memory, about literature, archives, and hermeneutics. And in it, you seem to ask, and please correct me if that's wrong, sort of after the ways we interpret now. And also launch a kind of critique of what I would call the hermeneutics of suspicion, you know, very paranoid reading of sort of macro structures. Could you maybe say a bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. That's a fascinating question. So, growing up as a college student, I realized something, and that was my professors, my mentors, the people I was learning from, were teaching us something that they had never been taught. So studying in the early 2000s in Portugal, where I did my BA and my master's, most, if not all, of my professors had been taught in the philological European tradition. And that in Portugal means something very specific. It means basically to read the French canon, the English canon, eventually the American canon, being highly indebted to the French thinkers of the 50s and the 60s, and applying sort of philological lenses to the texts that you are reading. So my professors were all formed in this school where they devote all of their career to one single author, maybe one single text, one single book. And those were their dissertations, their theses, their books. And that kind of highly reverential approach to literature, that kind of very intimate relationship with an author, with a highly canonical figure, was something that was disappearing by the time that I was in college. And the professors were instead teaching courses on what we would call literary studies, or perhaps cultural studies. So they were teaching courses on feminism, environment, race in relation to the texts, history in relation to literary texts. And that is something that they had never been taught to do, but they were creating as they were going. So that prompted me to ask the question: can you teach on a paradigm in which you were never actually trained? And that was my leading question, and I formulated it as something like, how can philology give way to cultural studies, and what is gained and what is lost in this kind of process? So that was my master thesis. The title was On the Consequences of the Disaggregation of Philology, a reflection from the point of view of literary theory. And I think that my core question was precisely that. What changes in the way that you read a text, in interpretation? What kind of hermeneutics is activated by philology or by literary studies, cultural studies? And I found some interesting answers along the way. I don't think that I have a final answer to that, but I believe that, probably the most interesting finding, if we can call it that, or the most interesting reflection was that, to a very large extent, what we do, and we call it cultural studies, deconstruction, postcolonial theory, or postcolonial readings, in many senses is remarkably close to what philologists were doing by the end of 19th century. So that was one of the responses I tried to develop to my questions.
I mean, that's fascinating, especially given your recent turn to postcolonial theory, and I think you do articulate a lot of your work through that lens. But can you maybe talk a bit more about what you mentioned just now, about what is both lost and what is gained through that kind of lens, and where you see sort of the limits of using this lens for your current work, which obviously deals more with the question of the micro-encounter and that kind of, unruly moment maybe in travel writing that's always more defined or dominated by the gaze of the white male traveler abroad in these colonial territories.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So one of the aspects that has never ceased to fascinate me is how the closeness or the attentiveness to a specific text leads you to certain questions. That is, the closer you are to an author, to a text, to a book, the more familiar the answers to your questions will be to you. And I started realizing that, to a certain extent, the answers to our questions were already implied in the question. So that was something that became integral to the philological paradigm. So you'd have the figure of the person who knows everything about one specific author or knows everything about one specific text. and that is the creation of the expert, right? The scholar as an expert. And I started realizing that even within paradigms such as postcolonial studies, that was becoming a thing. And I'm obviously thinking about, the crystallization of certain interpretations, the solidification of certain arguments, certain discursive modes. That is the creation of a genre of interpretation in which we pretty much know what the answer will look like once we ask the question. And I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to have the chance to be confronted with unexpected findings, unexpected answers. And the way that I found to do that was precisely to focus on the micro encounters. And that's why I turned to the travelogues, and within the travelogues to what I call specific scenes of encounter. And that is when you have agents coming from distant places, from very different backgrounds. You have all these white men traveling from the US and from Great Britain and from Canada to Angola or to Portugal and Brazil, and encountering realities that are unfamiliar to them, encountering contexts, urban environments that are unfamiliar to them, and at the same time include elements that come from their own spaces. And that's why I focus specifically on trains and the idea of acceleration, speed, railways. All of these technologies were actually imported around this time period, so the early 20th century, from the global north to the global south. And these travelers are encountering these technologies, they are using these technologies to move around, and at the same time they are interacting with men and women and creating dynamics of power, negotiation, collaboration. So that's why I focus on these very, very tiny scenes where you can actually see two human beings interacting, exchanging something, negotiating something. And I think that somehow zooming in on these micro encounters, these micro practices, has given me the chance to find unexpected answers to some of my questions.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think what I would like to hear a bit more about is sort of this element of being surprised by the encounter. Because we often tend to think of it, being so structured by the gaze of the white male writer coming to these spaces, sort of imposing his view on both the technology and sort of the inevitable progress supposedly brought by colonization. And maybe you could say a bit more about how you try and read these micro encounters also against the grain, to sort of find a surprising way that there is a collaboration with locals, or maybe that we can find examples of, local sabotage, subversion, or, the way that the supposedly dismissed other is actually always present and acting like and has, their own agency to intervene and sort of surfaces in your reading.
Certainly. So, as you just put it so eloquently, we tend to assume certain kind of positions, and we tend to ascribe certain subjectivities according to who is actually acting on these scenes. What I have been realizing is that there is a huge margin for the unexpected in these encounters. And when technology kicks in, this is even more interesting, because in many of these places, what you see is the indigenous, or the locals if you wish, using these foreign interventions upon their landscape, using these foreign bodies like the trains, the locomotives, the tram cars, the railways, the tracks, using all of these to renegotiate the terms of the relationship. And that is incredibly interesting. So I'll just give you 3 examples from the 3 geographies that I'm working with. And I'll start with Angola. In some of the travelogues, and this is interestingly, this is a constant, this is something that you read across the books. You see that all of the foreigners hire a huge amount of local work. So a normal expedition into the interior of Angola would hire around 100 to 150 porters just to carry the luggage. And fascinatingly, the speed of the acceleration, the pace of the acceleration, the rhythm of the march is constantly negotiated between the white foreigners and the black porters. And that sometimes gives rise to certain circumstances where you see the traveler inscribing something on the narrative that is on the travelogue, and you can sense that that's not the whole story. There's something more than that. And then you start doing some research, you start asking some questions to the text, trying to read between the lines. And sometimes there's fascinating things. I found this in 1926, Malcolm Burr, this British traveler who was in Angola doing some prospection for coal basins, he was confronted one morning with a parade of his porters dressed up in the European fashion, and they were protesting the wages that they were getting. And that was their way of inverting the position, forcing a stop and saying, no, we need to negotiate. So this is one example. In Portugal, you see the same thing. You see that the travelers coming from the global north have a very hard time negotiating fares, for instance. And the tip, the gratuity that they are demanded to provide is always a coin to negotiate relative positions of power. So they use these technologies of transportation across the country, but the speed, the speed of the displacement, and even sometimes the trajectories of the displacement are being negotiated with the locals through the tip. So if you give a generous tip, you might be allowed to go to some places, whereas if you don't, people will create obstacles to the progression of your journey. That's very interesting. The same thing happened in Rio. One incredible example is when American and Canadian transnational companies were entering the city of Rio de Janeiro to create a network of public transportation, the tram cars, or as they are known in Brazil, bonde. There was a campaign of sabotage of the tracks during the night by the owners of mule companies, because they were doing the transportation of people and commodities and cargo throughout the city, and they realized that their monopoly was being attacked. It was under attack by this transnational company called Light, that was based actually in Boston, I'm sorry. And they were sabotaging the tracks at night to prevent the advancement of the project. So this was a way of negotiating speed, acceleration, and the mobilization of bodies across the city in ways that were unexpected by the promoters of these transnational systems of circulation and displacement. So these are only three examples of very small scale settings that provide us scenes of encounter where these things are mediated, negotiated, and disputed.
Yes, and surprising openings for refusal and a different kind of collective, politics of counter, coloniality, possibly. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. One more question as well on maybe the importance of different media for your work. Because I know we've been talking a lot about travel writing, but I know you also comment a lot on the photography that goes along with the writing, that maybe it's even more open, has a bit more of a margin for reinterpretation even than a writing that's so dominated by the colonial gaze. But the photography is always, I know you talk about Ariella Azoulay's work a lot, is always itself a collaboration between the one taking the photograph and the people who are depicted. So maybe you could say a bit more about also your counter readings of photography and the importance of different media for your work.
Absolutely. Yes, so most of these travelogues were being published in big cities, London, New York, Edinburgh, and they were published along with photographs that were done on site by the authors most of the times. And what I find highly revealing is the way that sometimes these photographs contradict the narrative of the travelogue. Because whereas in the travelogue you have one voice that dictates what the reader is supposed to know and to gain access to. And that voice is obviously of the white northern author who goes there and wants to give an account to the ones reading back home, that is the armchair traveler that is comfortably reading the travelogue by the fire. Photography doesn't allow exactly that. In photography, as you mentioned, the work by Professor Ariel Azoulay has been paramount to me. In photography, you have what Azoulay calls a civil contract. That is a moment where the positions are open to all the agents inside the space of the photography. And actually, Azoulay has this brilliant metaphor of the shutter. When the shutter is open, you have potential histories developing within this frame. And that's what I have been trying to, in a way, excavate in these photographs. How can you read the travelogue against the photography and the photography against the travelogue? And how can you somehow try to understand a little bit better the life, the position, and the agency of the ones who are inscribed in the photography, but whose voices do not make it to the text? What are they doing there? Why are they important? What's their function? What were they thinking probably at that point, right? So that's why photography is so important to me as well. And lately, you mentioned that I've been trying to somehow open up my methodological approach and include other kinds of materials. So for instance, I've been using film, not necessarily from these places, but moving images that somehow recast the identities of the people, even when you go abroad and you go to Angola, Portugal, or Brazil. You always have these kind of stereotypes. You always have, or archetypes probably, and they intervene when you take your camera and do a photography of a landscape or of people or of moving trains. So I've been trying to create connections between these archetypes and these photographies and the travelogues, and see how these things correlate on a less disciplinary or even geographical grounds, and try to, connect these dots, make bridges between things that usually do not go hand in hand, and what changes when you do that, right? What changes when you take a photography from a travelogue written in Angola and compare that to one of the Lumière brothers' early movies, for instance.
That's great. I mean, I have 1,000 more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining us, Pedro. That was beautifully put, and I think also a great closing point. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.